I'm Martin Hughes. I'm the Dean of Music Humanities and Media here at the University, and it's my honour to chair this inaugural lecture and to introduce our lecturer this evening. I'll do that hopefully relatively expeditiously because you aren't here to listen to me, and then we'll listen to Aaron's lecture, hopefully have time for some interesting questions, and then we'll finish at around 7:30 hopefully. So, Professor Aaron Cassidy. Aaron joined us in 2007. He previously did a PhD in composition as a presidential fellow at the University of Buffalo, SUNY. He's progressed rapidly through what classes the ranks in academic speak. He was promoted to leadership in 2012, and then to his professorship in composition last year in 2014. He's currently Director of Research, or in effect of the music unit of coordinate of assessment at the university, and Director of Composition for the Centre for Research in New Music. Aaron, as I'm sure most of you are only too aware, is as well as being by far the most dapper dresser in the school, is a composer, a conductor, an author, producer, and cyclist. I think we're going to hear a little bit of all those in one shape or other in the course of the next hour. And I won't attempt to give you even the kind of briefest of conspectuses of his career, but his work has been programmed by an extraordinary range of music specialists and ensembles. As a conductor, he's conducted again in an impressive range of venues, including, of course, the Huddersfield Contemporary Music Festival. His published output is extensive, including his Noise In and As Music, published by the University Press in 2013, and he's also had a very active career as a CD producer. As a humble historian, I'm not even going to begin to try and explain or describe to you the nature of the substance of Aaron's works or the kinds of things that have particularly motivated his research and composition. I'm sure he'll do that far better himself than I ever could. So I think with that brief introduction, I will just hand you over to our Professor of Composition, Professor Aaron Cassidy.
And thanks very much for coming. It's great to see lots of familiar faces, including some from outside of the university. I'd like to just make a couple of informal comments before I start formally. The first is just to say that I'm deeply honoured and humbled by the professorial appointment. When I came here in 2007, this was one of the very few places in the world that would have hired me because of what I do as a composer rather than in spite of what I do as a composer. But even with that said, the support that I've had from this institution has been absolutely extraordinary, has gone well beyond what I could have possibly imagined when I started here. There have been performances, recordings, publications, various projects, a whole range of opportunities that wouldn't have happened without this institution's support, and I just wanted to say on record that it's an absolutely amazing place to work. I wanted in particular to thank a couple of people, some of whom are here and some of them are quickly arriving on a taxi. The first is Monty Adkins, who was enormously supportive and helpful in his role as research coordinator. Lisa Colton, as subject area leader for music, whose flexibility and approaches to staffing and whose encouragement to develop my role were instrumental in my progression over the last several years. Bryn Harrison, who's been a superb colleague and partner in crime for the last 7 or 8 years. And finally, Lisa Lim, who is, as I say, on her way from the airport, who has been an important friend and mentor for helping to encourage an even higher level of professionalism and ambition, and for her role in creating and sustaining what is a legitimately world-leading environment for contemporary music. It's worth noting as well that all 4 have played an important role in helping me negotiate and juggle the pressures of research, teaching, administration, and keeping a healthy work-life balance. And to that end, I'm deeply grateful to the support of my family, not least to my wife, Pei, who is my closest companion and friend, and who puts up with me even when she shouldn't. Second, I hope that you'll indulge 2 deviations from the norm. The first is that I'm reading a prepared text, in fact, even here in the introduction, which is something that I almost never do for public presentations, and frankly is something that I usually avoid at all costs. But the reason for that prepared text is connected to the second deviation, which is that rather than presenting on work that I've already done, what I'm going to discuss today is very much a work in progress. In most circumstances, I tend to speak only with fairly limited notes and in a fairly extemporaneous style, but most of what I'll discuss today is speculative, and some of it is pretty uncertain, and I hope you'll forgive me for presenting those speculations in such a public forum. These are issues and concepts that are still open questions for me, and they're the issues that I think will probably dominate my work and thinking over the next several years. The title of today's talk is Imagining a Non-Geometrical Rhythm. I've been thinking a lot about curves lately. For the last year or so, I've been mulling over various musical metaphors of arcs and bends, and to a certain extent, circles, bubbles, branches, and various liquid movements through curved spaces. In many ways, my thinking began to take shape in conversations with Alex Grimes, a former composition master student, through his interests in notions of viscosity, pressure, and resistance. We spent quite a lot of time in our lessons talking about various models for musical curves, music, and in particular rhythm, as molten lava, as a moving, unstable, viscous state, solidifying and melting, hardening and splintering as it cools, liquefying into a gelatinous ooze as it heats up. I've been struggling for some time with concerns about an increasing ubiquity of notational grids, and in particular the overwhelming dominance of the horizontal and the vertical in the notation of rhythm. This was a dominant image not only in my own work, but in the works of many others. And I was noticing it particularly strongly in the work of a group of young, emerging composers, including, for example, Timothy McCormack, a former Huddersfield MPhil student, Mark Pollux, Robert Dahm, who's another former Huddersfield student, or, for example, Andrew Greenwald. Horizontal and vertical lines were becoming the central defining feature of the notational identity of a significant body of work. And it was clear that this had crucial implications on the kinds of materials that those notations could support. Ironically, given this predilection for the horizontal and the vertical, my music has always been about in-between states. It's always been about the glissando, the timbral transition, the movement between bow positions or pressures, the change from one embouchure tension to another, the constant shift from one dynamic to another. That is to say, it's always been about the diagonal. The points on either side have been immaterial. They're simply the starting and stopping points of unstable transitional movements. From the beginning, this interest in transitional states has, to a certain extent, fought against the notational conventions of Western musical rhythms, which depict the onset and duration of a musical event in a single notational mark. Any notation of what happens after the onset relies on other notational layers, and implicitly, one might argue, assigns a certain secondary status to those additional instructions. The note is primary, and whatever dynamic or timbral change that follows is purely subsidiary. The note prioritizes attack. Its primary rhythmic identity is where and when its indicated sound starts, and from a purely proportional standpoint, how long it lasts. In traditional Western musical notation, even its actual duration relies on secondary notational cues, time signatures, tempo indications, metronome markings. The rhythmic symbol system indicates the number of beats for which a note might be sustained, but we require other information to let us know how long a beat is, and indeed even what rhythmic unit a beat might be. Additional layers of parametric change, that is, dynamics, performance techniques, timbre, etc., are superimposed. Once a note has been sounded, our notational conventions generally assume that the job is done. Those additional notational layers have taken on increasing primacy in my work over the last few years. Since 2004, my work has focused almost exclusively on the development of an extended tablature notation that has redirected the role of notation from descriptive representations of a desired sounding result towards more prescriptive representations of movements and actions. In the earliest works in this project, for example, in the Crutch of Memory for solo string instrument from 2004, shown here, each layer of physical activity, each type of interaction between the player's body and their instrument, is given a separate, discrete staff, and each of these staves are rhythmically independent. Arm position, finger widths, bowings, bow pressure and position, etc., all move independently, and each of these layers is in a more or less continuous state of change. By way of example, here's the final minute or so of the piece. The rhythmic identity of what we actually hear in these works often sits at a substantial distance from the rhythmic information that's shown on the page, and that's perhaps intensified in more recent works, such as what then renders these forces visible as a strange smile for solo trumpet. At a fairly basic level, neither tempo nor meter ever really are present sonically, for reasons that will be discussed later. And perhaps even more significantly, what we see as a rhythmic event is often just a change of direction, a change of state, or the point at which some other modification of an already shifting and unstable sound begins. That is, the rhythm that is represented by the note in this notation is very rarely actually an event in itself. It's more often part of a continuum or the apex of a turn. The fact that this happens on several independent layers simultaneously exacerbates the issue. And already in these earlier tablature works, it's possible to see the role of rhythm breaking down even more dramatically. In the excerpt shown here, one can see rhythmic onset points in which the triggered event is itself an unstable, unrhythmicized fluttering. The accents help to articulate the indicated rhythm, but the actual changes in the actions of the embouchure are not explicitly rhythmicized and have gestural identities independent of the rhythmic and metric grid. Even more recently, the primacy of these shifting, transitional movements has been brought further to the notational foreground. Starting in 2010 with my second string quartet, I've been working with a multicolored, multi-layered tablature notation that, like the earlier tablature work, indicates the movements of the performers rather than the sonic results of those movements. But here there's been an effort to create a more direct, more communicative, and frankly simpler notation for these movements. In this newer notation, the movement of the left and right hands, shown in black and red respectively, are shown graphically as lines of varying thickness and hue to represent the movements across the length of the fingerboard and string, as well as the amount of pressure exerted by the fingers or bow. All of the local level gestural movements of the hands are shown graphically, including changes in the spacing between the fingers of the left hand and various forms of vibrato, trills, finger percussion, tremolos, and mordents. What's most important here notationally is that the material starts to look less explicitly parametrical as compared to the earlier multi-stave works. Although there's an identical level of independence of the various planes of potential activity, the notational image is far more unified and far more explicit in its connection to physical gesture. The earlier notation required a certain translation in its mapping from notation to instrument. In the Crutch of Memory, for example, arm position, finger widths, fingerings, and bowings were all represented by numbers. The transition from a narrow to a wide finger width might be represented by a boxed 1 moving to a boxed 4 connected by an arrow. In the newer notation, this change in width is instead represented graphically, as seen in the black lines that get further apart in the example here. The movements now no longer look like discrete staves, but instead appear in the score as the transitional, shifting, unstable movements that they really are. To put a finer point on it, the earlier notation still relied on the notion of the note, or the note head. The earlier notation was about dots, whereas this newer notation is about lines. Graphically, the movement between states has now been foregrounded in the visual representation of the notation, whereas in the earlier work, what had been foregrounded was the static state on either end of that movement. The instability of those movements and the prevalence of shifting amorphous movement can be seen in the following example from the final few minutes of the piece. It also clearly demonstrates some of the more unconventional performance techniques connected to the tablature notation. With the move towards this increased foregrounding of physical movement, rhythm's been pushed further and further to the periphery of my notational approach. It started initially by severing the link between note heads and rhythms, and in recent works this has been pushed even further, now very much on the relative margins of notational information. It becomes increasingly clear from a visual standpoint that rhythm in these works is skeletal, a frame on which events and activities are hung. I've spoken in the past about this tablature approach as being a more honest notational representation of my material. If my compositional materials were movements and not pitches, then the notation should reflect that. Notation, above all, helps to establish the implicit and explicit hierarchies in a work. So reorienting the notational image is a crucial redirection towards particular interpretive cues and ciphers. A few years ago, I gave a talk at our department's research forum on my multicolored tablature work. In the Q&A session that followed, my colleague Jeff Cox asked a characteristically insightful question, which, to paraphrase, went something like this. You've done all this work over the years to change how you notate almost every possible musical parameter. Why does your rhythmic notation still look like that? What Jeff identified, I think, was a certain distance, perhaps even dishonesty, between the notational representations of rhythm and what the actual rhythmic materials were, or at least could have been. This is not in any way to say that the rhythms I was working with in earlier pieces were illegitimate, but rather that they were a skeleton, a framework, and that they were increasingly divorced from the rest of the materials that I was working with. The rhythms had structural significance, and they certainly had a reality as materials in their own right, but they were less integrated with the physical activity of the work that otherwise dominated the music's language. Rhythm, meter, pulse, duration, and tempo were treated as a kind of structural given. They formed a collection of proportional relationships and speeds that sat beneath the surface. More recently, however, I've been looking for a way to make the gestural, physical activity of my music and the rhythms of those movements much more explicitly connected, which brings us back to curves. When I first started seriously rethinking my approach to rhythm, I began obsessively drawing curves, though I wasn't entirely sure why. They were initially just simple arcs, and what struck me was how immediately, how instinctively, I started overlaying Euclidean Cartesian grids on these arcs. They started as movements, as simple arcing gestures through space, but through conditioning perhaps, or through a certain intuitive desire to find connections and patterns, they became geometries. In an effort to explore this tendency further, I started paying attention to any arcs, curves, or bends that I would find in my daily life. Tree branches, telephone wires, cloud formations, bubbles, streams. What I quickly discovered was that the common element for almost all of these shapes was an intersection between an intended or an inherent natural movement, energy, or trajectory, and a concomitant form of resistance, restriction, or friction. Telephone wires that otherwise wanted to be straight were curved by the force of gravity. Streams and rivers gained their curved shapes as their forces and energies reacted to the resistance posed by the density and geological makeup of the stone and rock and mud and sand that the water moved through. The shape of trees and plants was the result of a battle between an effort to reach up or outward towards the sun, the force of gravity, and the relative flexibility, strength, or stability of the material of its branches, vines, sprouts, or stems. I went back to drawing my curves, this time focused more intently on the relationship between movement, viscosity, and friction. The size and shape of the pen started to become important, and even whether or not I held the pen towards the tip, at the end, or at the end of the barrel, as did the nature of the ink, the pen nib, the texture of the paper, and even the surface the paper was sitting on. The shapes and identities of those curves quickly became less about an arc through Cartesian geometrical space, and much more about a byproduct or tracing of a kind of interference between movement, energy, fluidity, viscosity, and trajectory on one hand, and friction, abrasion, elasticity, and resistance on the other. Crucially, there was a clear connection in these arcs to speed and duration. These arcs were not neutral lines constructed of coordinates in striated space, but were rather the afterimage of physical movement. They were, in a sense, rhythms. Throughout the process of attempting to build a new way of working with rhythm, a new way of imagining rhythm, and a new way of notating that rhythm, I've continually come up against the brick wall of limitations of conventional Western rhythmic notation. Our rhythmic notation system can do some interesting things, but actually it's quite unsophisticated. The system we've inherited can really do only two things. It can indicate subdivision, and it can indicate proportion, and that's it. It can take a given unit and chop it up into a number of equal divisions of that unit, or it can group those divisions into juxtaposed values of whole number ratios. Traditionally, of course, units were only ever divided into 2s or 3s, but in principle, any number of equal divisions is possible, and of course, it's possible to subdivide those subdivisions. But the basic limitation remains. At a certain point in the system, it is a single unit that has to be divided, and those divisions have to be equal. Non-metrical juxtaposition of so-called additive rhythms is also possible, but again, the values that are juxtaposed need to be related by whole number ratios, and critically, our system only ever notates the proportional relationship between those values. Even with additive notation, we can halve or double a string of rhythmic values, and nothing, in truth, changes. To a very real extent, the notational values are immaterial. They could be replaced by a string of numbers representing proportion, and nothing in the essential rhythmic identity of the material would change. My former PhD student, Einar Torfi Einarsson, did some very interesting work exploring a slightly more intricate system of this kind of juxtaposition. In his work, Non-Vanishing Vacuum State, he sets up a notational system that allows for the juxtaposition of events that are subdivisions of separate streams of divisions of 4, 5, and 7, and these often add up to incomplete bars, which accounts for the unconventional additive time signatures of, for example, 320 plus 428 plus 516. And for those who haven't seen such things before, the 20 and the 28 work exactly the same as the 16, referring to the division of the whole note or semibreve into equal values. We're able to jump between duple, quintuplet, and septuplet note values in rapid succession, and we don't necessarily have to have complete sets of those pulse streams. In other words, we don't need 7 septuplets. We can, as in the example here, have 4. Even in this inventive system, the time signatures still show us the fundamental limitation of the underlying notation. We're stuck with subdivisions, and equal subdivisions at that, even if we can cobble them together in interesting and unpredictable ways. It's worth noting that this approach has its roots in the notational experiments in coloration of the ars ulterior some 600 years earlier, wherein notes appearing in red rather than black have 2/3 their normal rhythmic value, which permits a kind of sliding between duple and triple divisions. The most extreme examples of the era, for example, the Rodericus Ballade under Lum Salat, which is shown here, include incomplete groupings, not unlike Einar's work. As we'll discuss in a moment, speed and duration are for me the two most critical components of rhythm. How fast and how long. Neither of these two components are present in any primary sense in our rhythmic notational system. In the examples I've just shown, all we have is proportion. There's absolutely no indication whatsoever of how long any of these items actually lasts in time, how fast we move from one notational item to the next. For speed and duration to exist, our system requires a secondary notational indication. We need a tempo, a metronome marking, something to tell us how fast any given item within the system might be, and that tempo is predicated on an assumption of pulse or beat. Conventional notation, of course, does allow us to change that pulse through an accelerando or rallentando, and allows us to freeze, sustain, or interrupt that pulse through various notational cues, such as a fermata or caesura. And there have been various attempts to extend this ability to destabilize tempo. In my work, And the Scream, Bacon Scream is the operation through which the entire body escapes through the mouth. For example, I use a conductor's staff, which forces the tempo to speed up and slow down irregularly and unpredictably in an effort to counteract the centrality of pulse. A similar approach appears in Karlheinz Stockhausen's Klavierstück X, with 12 proportionally related tempi indicated by the 13 lines. And Einar, again, explores an interesting system in his work Desiring Machines for 27 players, with a tempo system that allows for rapid juxtapositions between 5 independent tempi, and in this case also 2 independent conductors. A related and similarly novel approach appears in the work of the German-American composer Philipp Blume, who's developed a notation for flexible and nested tempi. In this example, from Euga Klugerella for trombone quartet, the beams that look like eighth note beams in fact represent tempo, with pulse speeding up as the lines move away from the staff and slowing down as they approach the staff. These can be nested as well, as in the example shown, with up to 6 internal levels of acceleration or deceleration embedded within other accelerations and decelerations. With these experiments in tempo, we get somewhat closer to what I imagine to be a non-geometrical rhythm. But in truth, what we really have is bent or distorted or curvilinear spaces. In each case, the grid is still the dominant rhythmic principle. We're still in a Euclidean space. And in each case, we maintain a reliance on beats, even if those beats can be expanded and compressed and juxtaposed in interesting ways. We often conflate rhythm and beat in Western music. In my rethinking of my rhythmic language of the last few months and years, I've tried to force myself to really return to first principles, to thoroughly interrogate what the most fundamental characteristics and properties of rhythm actually are. For me, beat, and even more so the repetition of beats through pulse, is actually only a fairly small subcomponent of rhythm. It's true that rhythm is about pattern, repetition, and regularity, but it's also about speed and slowness, about compression and dilation, about waves and clouds, about stasis and absence, and about vibration and dissipation. Even a sustained drone has a rhythm of sorts. And now, if you'll indulge me, I'd like to illustrate the point with an example from, and this will be very predictable for those of you who know me well, competitive cycling. We'll start with the opening sequence of the television show In Cycle, which I think shows more or less what we instinctively think of when we think of rhythm. So in this example, the visual rhythms are pretty apparent, and they're connected mostly to cycles, obviously. That is, the regular repetition of the cadence of pedaling, where each pedal stroke is a beat, and to a slightly lesser extent, the rotations of cogs, wheels, and hubs. This is a rhythm about pulse, loops, and regularity, and that's reflected in the accompanying music and sound design. Next, I want to look at a few minutes of the overhead shot from the final few kilometers of the 5th stage of the Tour de Suisse from last year. Obviously, we can occasionally see the pedal revolutions of the riders, but the dominant rhythm of this video is much more smooth and gooey. The swarm of the group is liquid, as individual riders speed up, slow down, move into and out of position, weave around a road obstacle or a curve in the road, or pass a train moving in the opposite direction. We do see effort, and to a certain extent we see and feel the speed, but the overall impression, particularly when viewed above, is actually quite slow. This is rhythm as wave, as swarm, as cloud, or constellation, ebbing and flowing, weaving, rather than beating.
Modolo, c'est quand même très tendu, Frédéric. Hein. Non, c'est pas Sacha Modolo, c'est un de ses coéquipiers, mais Didier a quand même... C'est très tendu, il n'y a pas vraiment d'équipe là qui envoie. On a vu l'équipe Saxo rouler 300-400 mètres puis disparaître. Tony Martin en a fait autant. Maintenant l'équipe Omega Pharma revient à nouveau. L'équipe Giant est de l'autre côté de la chaussée. Oh, il y a Brian Cocard qui est très maître. Un coup de tête, un coureur de l'équipe IAM Cycling. Là il va falloir jouer des coudes et il va falloir, comme on dit, un petit peu débrancher le cerveau hein, avant le dernier virage, avant l'avant-dernier virage. Parce que ça va arriver très très vite et on voit bien que c'est très tendu. Ouais. Ils vont aussi vite que le train. Hein. Alors les Giants. Les Giants, il y a l'embarras du choix. Hein. De Genkolm, De Kort, Mesgetz, Sinkeldam aussi. Je pense que Sinkeldam d'ailleurs est en train de faire le travail. Je vois Tom Dumoulin également, le deuxième du classement général qui roule, c'est un gros rouleur, Tom Dumoulin. Sacha Modolo est bien placé, mais il y a un moment ça va se resserrer. Il est tout seul pour l'instant, Brian Cocard. Ouais, ils se sont perdus. Hein. On voit bien, il s'est retourné, il a regardé. Il va prendre Warren Barguil, ça serait peut-être Warren Barguil là, qui essaye de remonter pour les Giants, avec Brian Cocard qui prend sa roue sans trop la prendre parce que ça le fait remonter. Non, non, il y a sur la gauche de la route, je crois qu'il y a un mouvement qui est en train de remonter à la hauteur de Brian Cocard. C'est pas mal du tout. Non, c'est pas en mouvement. C'est pas en mouvement, c'est Pichot. C'est Pichot, ouais. C'est Pichot qui est remonté à hauteur de Brian Cocard. Mais il a perdu. Oh là là, le nombre de Giants devant, c'est quelque chose. Hein. Barguil a demandé aux autres de reprendre le relais. Tom Dumoulin va s'y coller. Les IAM également sont là. Est-ce que Hausler va vouloir faire le sprint? Et c'est au tour des coéquipiers de Peter Sagan maintenant de s'y mettre. Les Cannondale. La flamme rouge. Le dernier kilomètre, suspense garanti.
Sorry, ruin the suspense. We'll actually stop. there. What I want to do next, though, is zoom in. What I'd like to show is some onboard footage from exactly the same stretch of exactly the same race. The rhythms here are entirely different. The impression of speed is obviously different, and while we do have more of the pulse-based rhythm from pedaling, we also have the rhythms of every wobble, every bit of steering input, every little touch of the brakes, the starting and stopping of pedaling motions, the rhythm of riders passing or being passed, the rhythms of the elbows out rough and tumble world of near collisions common to the last few kilometers before a closing sprint, the changes in speed of the lead rider, he's the one with the camera, and his teammate behind, the occasional touch of a shoulder or leg to try and open up a gap, the yelling of instructions between teammates and the yelling of obscenities between opponents, and perhaps most notably, the elegance of the flowing waves around the traffic furniture of the previous video is replaced by the sudden whizzing by of road islands and warnings of police whistles. So here we are. So in this case, we have a complex network of micro-events and micro-rhythms. Some of them are regular and repetitive, like the rocking of the bike at the end of the looping, or at the end, or the looping of pedaling motions. And some of them are wildly irregular, unpredictable, unexpected, yet no less rhythmic. For me, it demonstrates just how limited many of our usual notions of rhythm really are. The grid, the pulse, the beat, the idea of meter more generally. These are just small components of what rhythm is and can be. Even tempo as a concept is quite limited in our musical vocabulary. When I was an undergraduate, I studied briefly with the composer Paulina Louveros, and in her various deep listening exercises, she taught us to engage with the rhythm of natural phenomena like clouds or wind, and indeed the rhythm of all of the various sounds that surround us. There have been many attempts to subvert the dominance of pulse and meter, but these almost always start with the presumption that notation only exists as a means to an end. They are all workarounds that imagine a particular kind of sounding result and then attempt to get as close as possible to that result through the existing notational conventions. In a sense, the notation doesn't actually represent the material. It simply attempts to trick a performer into doing something that sounds like the material. In the work of Xenakis or Ligeti, whose work Atmosphère is shown here, for example, we often see conventional 4/4 time signatures and stable tempi coupled with the instruction that bar lines exist for coordination purposes and hold no particular agogic function. In other words, the grid is present, but these composers are attempting to subvert or reject its presence. They ask the performer to ignore the graphical representations of the grid. But even this instruction can't undo the fact that the beats are present, that the points of alignment exist at stable, regularly repeating intervals, and all of the subsidiary components of each bar still realign because of the limitations of subdivision and proportion discussed already. From the opposite end of the spectrum, we have composers such as Brian Fernyhough, for whom the grid is exceptionally important, but is often scarcely audible, as in the excerpt from the third string quartet shown here. Meter has a pivotal structural role, not only as a container of a certain number of possible beats or pulses, but even more significantly as an organizational unit with its own magnetic forces, pushing and pulling material, compressing or expanding it, passing it through various overlaid sieves and filters. But at the end of those procedures, the links between what is left on the rhythmic surface, Fernyhough often talks about this as sediment, and any sonic manifestation of the grid is at best tenuous, and more often than not, non-existent. My own earlier work is quite closely connected to this approach. To illustrate, let's look back at the very first example that I showed you at the very beginning of the talk, from the solo voice piece, I, Purple, Spat Blood, Laugh of Beautiful Lips. The rhythms here are constructed, in a sense, from grids of grids. This short excerpt sounds like this. The primary grid is constructed from beats linked to the tempo, in this case mostly eighth notes, but with 2 bars of 30 seconds interspersed. Next we have a series of cross rhythms that divide the bar or beat into separate overlaid subdivisions or grids. And of course those subdivisions can themselves be subdivided, in this case just by the standard divisions of 2. And in this case, an extra layer of cross rhythms are superimposed. But if we then pull away all of the silent components from the grid, that is, any point on the grid at which no new event occurs, and combine the 3 layers into a single illustration of each pulse, and if we remove our original beams, which indicated metrical groupings, what are we left with? In a sense, we see the actual surface rhythms of this passage, but in another sense, we've eliminated rhythm altogether. Set against the blank backdrop, the context of pulse is, and so to a rather crucial degree, the character of the rhythm has been eliminated as well. Here's the excerpt again. For me, the most significant element that we've lost is the potential for syncopation, for material that appears off the beat. We've also lost grouping. We've lost the notion of the downbeat, and all the various implicit and learned weightings and clumpings that come with it. It's now a smooth space, and without its striations, there's no longer any pushing or pulling, any sense of gravitation, suspension, anticipation, or fulfillment. And it's here that we can pivot to start talking about alternative models, notational models, and possible ways of addressing some of the problems of conventional Western music notation posed above. Many composers in the mid and late 20th century worked with systems of various forms of time-space notation, almost always relying on indication of time in seconds, usually with some small tick or dash or reference marker. In some ways, we've reintroduced the grid, but it's somehow a rhythmically irrelevant grid. Its logic and its reality are immaterial to the nature of the rhythms themselves, so the reintroduced striations don't really provide much of the tension or friction we had previously. The grid is largely neutral, or at least musically neutral. So even though we have eliminated the notion of pulse or beat, and even though we now have a smooth rhythmic space in which to operate, the fact that this is happening against either a blank or neutrally striated background, for me means that we don't really yet have rhythm. We have events, and those events have relative durations, but somehow I think that we understand that even in a non-geometrical space, rhythms are fundamentally about groupings, about weight and pattern, and about vectors and trajectories of energy. What I'd like to do for the remainder of the talk is to explore some alternative rhythmic notational models that might permit the kind of non-geometrical space that, frankly, I've been searching for most of my compositional career. I have an image of a very particular rhythmic identity that I've not yet been able to grasp, and my sense is that the gap between what I want and what I have has come almost entirely from the limitations of existing notational practices. A significant portion of that desired rhythmic character derives from the fact that I've always had a very physical, visceral connection to music and music making. I've always been, first and foremost, a conductor, and there's always been a clear link between the body, physical shapes and movements, and to a certain extent, the groupings of beats. Those groupings and those shapes have always been essential to my understanding of rhythm, but I've often found that the regularity of those groupings, and even more so the regularity of potential subdivisions of those groupings, inadequate. So a lot of what I've done rhythmically as a composer has been set up to subvert, distort, or destabilize what are otherwise quite simple patterns. Over the last year or so, I've been exploring a variety of potential solutions to this problem, and those proposals attempt to explore issues of speed, of grouping, and of duration, including an attempt to integrate the fundamental inherent attributes of speed and resistance of various physical movements and gestures. Though it's worth reiterating at this point that none of these notational proposals are in a finished state, and are presented here very much as works in progress. I've also tried to force myself to separate this process into two independent strands, one about the nature of the rhythms that I'm interested in, and one about the more practical problem of notating those rhythms. One of the exercises that I've done, and this in fact comes from some advice I gave to Tim McCormack when he was studying with me several years ago, is to attempt to transcribe the music of non-notated traditions, in particular free improvisation, trying to find a way to represent rhythms that exist outside of the grid of traditional notational systems. The other extremely useful development has been my recent foray into electronic music, which has allowed me to focus directly on notions of speed and duration without having to worry about how to represent those attributes on the page. I'll show an example of the improvisation transcriptions in a moment, but in order to give a sense of the rhythmic character of the sound world that I'm imagining, here's an extract from the interlude for electronics that will appear in the work The Wreck of Former Boundaries, which will be discussed in a bit more detail shortly. This is roughly the first half of about a 10-minute piece. The easiest of the proposed notational solutions takes us back to the conversation of curves from the beginning of the talk. The revelation that these curves were the result or tracing of the intersection between an intended speed and various forms of friction or resistance has led me to explore notational models that represent those two features, velocity and resistance, as rhythmic values. The solution at this point is fairly rudimentary, but it aims to create a notational image that prioritizes perceived force and resistance as the primary arbiters of speed and duration, rather than relegating those characteristics to a secondary role beneath or inside of an independently derived set of pulses and subdivisions. The proposed notation is very simple. For now, I've stuck with stems to represent onset, but this is something that I'd like to continue to try to move away from. The downward arrows on each stem represent the degree of force or intended velocity, and the horizontal bars beneath those arrows represent the relative degree of resistance or friction, pushing against that movement. In the current models, these are arranged in a 3-point scale for each of the two directions, roughly equating to maximal, minimal, and intermediate degrees of velocity or resistance. And it's of course also possible in the notational system to construct transitions between these states. It's worth acknowledging that these are, for now, fairly imprecise measurements, and they do require a bit of imagination on the part of the performer. But the aim is that the actual speed or duration of an event will emerge from the event itself. That is, if the symbol system indicates how quickly one is trying to execute a particular task, as well as the level of real or imagined resistance pushing against that task, the final component that will determine the actual duration of that event is the specified movement. A prescribed amount of velocity and resistance, coupled with a prescribed movement, will result in an otherwise unprescribed event duration. To illustrate, I'd like to look briefly at the work One Flat Thing Reproduced by the choreographer William Forsythe, and in particular the audio voiceover that accompanies the dance in the amazing website called Sonorous Objects, produced at Ohio State University. The video has a number of overlaid animations that indicate types and planes of movement, as well as cue systems between the dancers that trigger new movements and actions. On its own, this is fascinating, but here what I want to focus on is Forsyth's sing-through, which I think illustrates an approach to rhythm that's very close to the one that I've been exploring. Forsyth's vocalizations show a wonderfully asymmetrical, unpredictable rhythmic character. This is clearly a dance rhythm that is not driven by metrical groupings and the stable grid of beats. As the video progresses, we can quickly see that the duration of any given rhythmic event is fundamentally intertwined with the actual movement of the dancer. That is, we have a specific type of movement, either sliding, arcs, or bends, an amount of space that movement is meant to fill, and a relative speed of that movement. The event's duration is the result of those three components rather than the other way around, as would be the case in, for example, much classical dance, wherein beat comes first and movement and space fit within that beat. I have to say the website sometimes doesn't play nice, so forgive me if it takes me 2 tries to load it. You can do it. We might have to skip it, and you might have to take my word for it. What happens in the video is that each movement you have these kind of arcs and movements where, for example, dancers are on desks sliding back and forth across those desks and queuing systems that come between those dancers. And something simple like an arc like this, which in a small space creates obviously a small arc and takes a very short amount of time. Exactly the same arc over a big space or over an even bigger space takes a longer amount of time. And Forsyth's voiceovers, as he's going through, he's counting, and the whole thing is really bizarrely asymmetrical, where he'll say, together, and now, and so it's this constant sort of ebbing and flowing of speed, but it's always linked to those movements. Instead of you looking at a non-working website. The website is amazing, but it works off of a version of Flash, which is now like 4 or 5 years out of date. So it works only on Safari, as far as I can tell, and about 1 in every 4 or 5 tries. But I tried. The force and resistance notation that I'm exploring works with a range of instruments and seems well suited to strings, particularly as connected to the tablature work that I've developed, and also seems to work well with the notation of breath in winds and brass. The rhythms, of course, don't work in isolation and require some kind of movement notation. What I've shown here is a short example from the sketches of the Wreck of Former Boundaries. The complete work is scored for 2 solo trumpets, clarinet, saxophone, trombone, double bass, electric lap steel guitar, and multi-channel electronics. Each of the players, except for the 2 soloists, will have a short, extractable solo work which can be played independently. And the first of these that I've been working on is the solo for double bass. This example shown here illustrates the kinds of movements that would determine the speed and duration of each of the work's events. Each collection of symbols represents a particular physical movement across the instrument, which on the double bass can be quite extreme, coupled with a speed or intensity of movement and a particular degree of resistance in the muscles of the arms and body. As with the second string quartet notation, the red material represents the movement of the bow up and down the length of the string, and the black notation represents the movement of the fingers along the fingerboard, though for the sake of this sketch I've simplified things a bit. Lateral up and down bow motion is indicated in green, and for the sake of this sketch there's no rhythmic independence at all between the various layers of possible activity. At this point, I've intentionally represented these movement events with equidistant spacing in the notation, rather than with some estimated time-space notation. As mentioned, the hope is that events are faster and slower, specifically due to the prescribed actions, rather than from a graphical spatial distribution on the page. It's the equivalent of the curves discussed above, the byproduct of a given configuration of energy, movement, and resistance. So, for example, the opening gesture, which is constructed from a heavy, aggressive pressure in the bow, sliding from an area near the end of the fingerboard towards the bridge, coupled with an up bow motion across the length of the bow, will be quite a long, slow, grinding gesture generated from maximal pressure or force and maximal resistance. I imagine that it would take something in the realm of 3 or 4 seconds. The second gesture, on the other hand, consists of very light pressure in the bow, represented by the thin red line, a slight down bow covering half of the length of the bow, and is guided by maximal velocity with minimal pressure. This is likely to be exceptionally short, thin, and fleeting, lasting no more than 1/4 of a second or so. This approach seems fairly well suited for solo materials, but perhaps still leaves problems for controlling the alignment between players in an ensemble setting. It also, at this point, doesn't show rhythmic groupings particularly well. So I've been exploring a parallel strand of notational models which attempt to show groupings, speeds, and durations, but do so in an intentionally smooth and loosely defined space. The second approach has been more of a struggle, and I've been fiddling with various sketches for solutions for many months. It's gone through several iterations, and in truth, I think probably there's still work to do before it's in its finished state. Also, for now, I'll just show this approach in the abstract, without any connections to movement, gesture, pitch, or other parameters. The notation has 3 primary components. The top staff indicates speed, and critically for my current needs, groupings. The top line of this staff is fast, the bottom line is slow, and these values and the space in between are left intentionally undefined. In the final version, I'm likely to give a general metronome marking range for the top and bottom lines, but my hope is that this will be unnecessary. This top staff permits both static speeds and transitional ones, and those transitions can be constructed of both diagonal lines and curves. And like some of the tempo and pulse examples shown previously, for example those of Einar Torfi Andersen, each new beat on this staff can be a completely new speed. The lower staff indicates a few things simultaneously. First, it shows the number of subdivisions of the speed unit shown on the top portion of the staff. Second, the placement and width of the horizontal boxes in this staff show the relative proportional relationship of those subdivisions. The staff can be imagined as a percentage space, with 100% at the bottom, that is, a single event, and 1% at the top. This initial example shown here simply recreates some very basic subdivisions common to a much more conventional notation. The first is 50-50, or ostensibly something like eighth notes. The second, 67-33, or triplets. The third, 25-50-25, which is something like 16th, 8th, 16th. Finally, the filled-in space inside each of these horizontal bars shows the actual duration of the event, again indicated graphically as a percentage of the subdivision. This notational component is something akin to a hybrid between rests and articulation. It shows how long something lasts within a subdivision of a given unit, but again the space is intentionally fuzzy in its definition, and as with the subdivision layer, is fully contingent upon a sliding, shifting speed layer that is itself only loosely defined. The example shown here is a more detailed, complicated version of the notation. In this case, one of the transcriptions of free improvisation that I mentioned earlier. This notation represents a short excerpt of the work from the trumpet player Peter Evans, who's one of the 2 trumpet soloists who will be featured in the record form of Boundaries. And I think here you can see the connection to the speeds, groupings, subdivisions, and durations in the audio sample from the very beginning of Peter's improvisation Sentiment from the album More is More. So, with those basic principles established, let's listen to the first minute or so of the improvisation. I've tried to be as precise as possible with the rhythmic notation, even notating reasonably subtle variations during the long sustained tone that occupies much of the excerpt. I carefully calculated the exact durations of events with the aid of a spectrosonogram, making decisions about how those durations would be grouped and represented in a fairly intuitive way. The goal, in any case, was to generate a rhythmic transcription that I felt accurately represented the energies, groupings, momentum, syncopation, and directionality that I hear in Peter's performance. It covers 2 slides, but I'll try and click across them as it goes, and hopefully you can follow along. When it gets to it's a very short excerpt, it takes about 45 seconds, and I warn you in advance that when you get to the end, it flies by really quickly. You'll get lost, I promise. Right. As I said, I promise you'll get lost. Just to wrap up, what I like about the system is that it removes pulse from the equation, but it does so in a way that still has a reasonably clear definitions of speed, and through the graphical indication of subdivision, duration. The goal for the project has always been to find models that foreground the notation of those two primary rhythmic features, speed and duration, and to do so through a visual model that doesn't require reference to other external notions of tempo and pulse, or to the limitations of equal subdivisions of note values. As an example of these limitations in conventional rhythmic notation, imagine a unit divided into a ratio of, for example, 9 to 5. Rhythmic notation of 9s and 5s are a particular pet peeve of mine, which would require a rather inelegant collection of ties and augmentation dots in traditional notation, even leaving aside the additional necessity of a tuplet bracket, an equally divided metered bar within which to contain that tuplet, with a time signature denominator divisible by 2, and separate and visually detached indication of tempo in beats per minute. I also like that the notation allows a speeding up or slowing down at a very local level. And here those changes of speed are an inherent part of the visual identity of the graphical image. Those changes of speed happen at what is, for me, an appropriate middle ground level, rather than exclusively at a more distant structural level. And I like that I can still show groupings, which for me take the essential element of meter, that is, a fundamental 3-ness, 4-ness, 2-ness, etc., and disassociate it from equal divisions into beats. And I like that this notational approach is quite flexible and can be combined with my recent tablature notation systems and with more conventional pitch notation. It can, of course, also be combined with the force versus resistance notational model that I showed previously, perhaps with the force resistance notation taking the place of the lower level of this proportion model. What I don't like about the model is that, still at this point, it looks quite similar to some of the highly geometrical and even architectural examples that I showed at the very beginning of the talk. Horizontal and vertical lines still dominate the visual character of this notation, so I'm still searching for something that better represents the curves and bends and bubbles and branches that I've been obsessing over for these last many months. The system does allow changes of speed that get shown through curved lines, but this seems like a fairly small and not particularly consequential nod in the direction of curved rhythms, or at least a curved rhythmic notation. In truth, the difficulty for me will always be the fact that representing time on the page, that is, taking a 4-dimensional event and reducing it to a 2-dimensional surface, will always force a certain reading of that space from left to right. The left to rightness of musical notation already starts to force a horizontal image on the blank page, and so lines and beams and staves follow. For the last 5 or 6 years, I've been poking around the edges at the idea of developing a video or animated notation which does away with the horizontal representation of time. For example, in my 2009 AHRC grant for the development of the second string quartet notation, for example, it proposed something akin to the Guitar Hero video game. But in the end, I'm a traditionalist and I love scores. I love bound scores on good paper, and I love the tradition of the performer's interface with the page. So it may be that the video project is for someone else to follow up. I also don't particularly like the multi-stave approach in this system. I'm looking at ways of integrating the information into a more unified image, but doing so in a way that prevents the image from simply becoming a flat, graphical time-space notation. I've experimented with various approaches to compressing the material into a single staff, but so far, in each case, the nested contingent element of the notation is removed, and it loses the resistance, twisting, and magnetic weighting present in the current proposed version. In any case, I'll keep working. Thank you.